Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, like it's a math problem.
Exactly. It feels almost like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, the doctor points to it and says, there it is, here's the cast.
It is a very binary experience. It's either broken or it's not broken.
Yeah, but then you step into the world of a rare blood cancer, like Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia, and suddenly, that x-ray machine is basically useless.
Completely.
The diagnostic and treatment landscape isn't this clear black and white picture. It is notoriously murky. It's fluid. So today, we're pulling from a stack of recent updates from the IWMF community.
Specifically, their mid-June rollout, right?
Right, the June 12, 2026 edition of their weekly newsletter. And our mission today is to figure out how patients actually navigate that murkiness. We are taking you, our listener, on a guided deep dive through every single update in this newsletter in the exact order it was published.
Which is a great way to do it.
We want to extract the vital takeaways so you are fully caught up without feeling overwhelmed. We are going to explore the hard science of kidney damage, the mechanics of next-generation drugs, and the sheer psychological weight of waiting for your next scan.
It really is an entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
And, what fascinates me about these community updates is how they blend things.
Yeah.
They take this raw, cutting-edge clinical data and mix it with the intensely human realities of living with a chronic disease.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to look at these updates sequentially, starting with the hidden engine room of disease research. Because, it is easy to focus purely on the scientists in the lab.
Oh, absolutely. The people in the white coats get all the attention.
Right. But before a researcher ever looks through a microscope, someone has to actually manage the funding. Which brings us to the first article, the introduction of Kim Schwartz as the new Grants and Contracts Administrator for the Foundation.
People so often gloss over staffing changes. They assume they're just, administrative footnotes.
Yeah, totally.
But in the rare disease space, a grants manager is essentially the central nervous system of research. And Kim brings over 6 years of nonprofit management experience, specifically in grant-making operations and research partnerships.
And the IWMF president, Dolores Senteft, really highlighted her collaborative spirit in the text, which has to be vital here.
It is. Because a brilliant researcher with a potential cure, well, they can't do anything without the financial architecture to support the clinical trials. The administrator is the literal bridge between the donor's dollar and the scientific breakthrough.
Without that bridge, the science just stops.
Exactly.
And so, moving from that financial infrastructure over to the educational side, the community just launched a massive summer video series. This is the second article. They are pulling the best sessions from both their U.S. and European educational forums.
Which is such a valuable resource.
It really is. When I look at the lineup, it functions almost like a highly specialized medical streaming service for patients.
Democratizing this knowledge is crucial. Patients are often handed a diagnosis and then just left to decode incredibly dense medical jargon completely on their own.
Right. Let's look at the 4 specific videos they dropped. The first one introduces the European Forum's central theme of chronos, or time.
Aha, yes, time.
Yeah, they frame the entire patient journey around this concept. Then the second video is the basics session. That one is with Dr. Peter Forsberg and Dr. Mattis from the U.S. Forum.
So that one is pure foundational knowledge.
Exactly. Then the third goes back to Europe. It's a fireside chat with Shirley Dessau about understanding your treatment timeline. They really dig into the complexities of the watch and wait phase and also continuous therapies like BTK inhibitors.
Watch and wait is such a tough phase.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the fourth video is Burnout Busters with Dr. Kevin Johns, zeroing in on the emotional toll of long-term care.
Highlighting burnout busters right alongside clinical treatment timelines is incredibly deliberate.
Oh, so?
Well, long-term treatment fatigue is just a massive, under-discussed issue. You aren't just fighting the cancer cells. You are fighting the exhaustion of endless doctor appointments, blood draws, pharmacy calls.
Just the sheer logistics of being sick.
Yes, exactly.
And I should mention, the updates make a point to give a huge shout-out to volunteer Rick Savoy for dedicating the hours to edit videos.
It takes a whole village.
It really does. Speaking of the day-to-day realities of living with a disease, the third article tackles another practical nightmare, which is employment. They announced a free virtual 16th National Conference on Work and Cancer. It's happening on June 26th in partnership with Cancer and Careers.
Medicine often fixates entirely on keeping the patient alive. But conferences like this focus on how you actually manage to live.
Right, because you still have to pay rent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It covers disclosure decisions.
Yeah.
Like, when do you tell your employer? How much do you legally have to reveal? How do you practically manage treatment side effects while you were literally on the clock?
Because a medical textbook won't help you navigate HR.
No, it definitely will not.
Which brings us to Article 4, the launch of a new online event photo gallery. It is this big collection of images featuring patients, caregivers, and staff at various events. But I actually have to push back here for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so we're talking about life-saving research grants. We are talking about the profound psychological burnout of fighting cancer and the crushing stress of managing your career during chemotherapy.
Right.
Why put so much emphasis on a photo gallery or, frankly, videos about the philosophical concept of time right next to clinical grants?
Yeah.
Is a photo gallery really moving the needle on fighting a blood cancer?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, treating a rare disease is fundamentally an exercise in fighting isolation.
Okay.
When you have an illness that most general practitioners haven't even seen in their entire careers, the loneliness can be physically crushing. A photo gallery isn't just some scrapbook. It is visual proof that you belong to a vibrant, living community.
I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah, and tying that back to the Chronos theme about time from the video series, it is about validating the patient's lived timeline. They're not just a statistic waiting for a cure. They are part of an active, engaged family right now.
That reframing helps a lot. And I guess once you build that infrastructure, the grants, the education, the community, you can actually focus on the cutting edge of the medicine itself.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to Section 2, the hard science. Article 5 highlights a recent nationwide Italian study on kidney function in symptomatic patients.
The renal data. This is where things get highly clinical.
Yeah, so the headline data from Italy is that 29.6%, so roughly 1 in 3 patients, already had reduced kidney function when they were first diagnosed with the disease.
That is a significant portion.
Wait, because when I saw that, my jaw dropped. The text explicitly points out that a previous U.S. study only found a 5.1% rate of renal dysfunction. That is a massive difference. What is going on there? Almost 30% versus 5%?
It is a striking contrast. And if you look at it, the researchers suggest it likely comes down to differences in the patient population and the exact timing of when the disease was studied.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, if the Italian study captured patients at a slightly more advanced symptomatic stage, the kidney involvement would naturally be higher just by definition.
But does standard chemotherapy destroy their kidneys even further?
What's fascinating here is the deeply reassuring takeaway. Even though reduced kidney function historically signals a higher risk of the disease progressing sooner, the treatment reality was incredibly positive.
Oh, really?
Yeah. These patients responded to standard treatments just as well as those with perfect kidneys. They didn't experience significantly worse side effects.
So treating the cancer actually clears out the filters.
Precisely. By knocking down the cancer cells, you stop the overproduction of those massive IgM proteins. The clogging stops, and the kidneys can stabilize or even improve.
That is amazing.
It is. Though I should mention the one major caveat noted in the text by the Foundation's science advisor, Lee Greenberg. This study explicitly excluded patients on BTK inhibitors. They only looked at standard therapy.
That is a crucial distinction. And speaking of BTK inhibitors, Article 6 dives into data from B1 Medicines. They presented at the massive ASCO 2026 conference.
Right, the ASCO data.
Yeah, they revealed 78-month data for Brukinsa. Here is the catch. The data is about chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL. Why is a Waldenstrom's update highlighting a CLL study?
Because CLL Waldenstroms are essentially B-cell cousins.
Oh, okay.
They arise from similar types of rogue immune cells, meaning their treatment pathways overlap heavily. Therapies like rituximab and BTK inhibitors like ibrutinib or zanubrutinib are highly effective in both.
That makes sense.
So seeing sustained long-term disease control at 78 months, which is over 6 years in CLL, with a next-generation inhibitor like Brukinsa, that is a massive green light for the entire B-cell cancer community. It proves the foundational pathway of BTK inhibition is safe and durable.
The text also drops a look at the future, specifically naming a drug called tucabrutideg. It notes this is a BTK degrader being developed for patients who have already used BTK inhibitors.
Yes, the degraders.
You know, all this complex science, the degraders, the kidney filtration, the 78-month data, it all eventually trickles down to actual human lives.
It does. It always comes back to the patient.
Which brings us to the community spotlights in Section 3. Article 7 is Susie Shook's comeback Cardi tale. And here's where it gets really interesting. In 2025, Susie was facing end of life. She was incredibly ill.
What a terrifying place to be.
Yeah, but she managed to enter a UCSF CAR-T cell therapy clinical trial.
CAR-T is such an intense process. They extract your own immune T cells, engineer them in a lab to recognize your specific cancer, and then infuse them back into your body to hunt the disease down.
And for Susie, it worked. She went from taking daily medications to being entirely medication-free.
Incredible.
And just to prove her stamina, on June 7th, Susie and her brother Nick rode in America's most beautiful bike ride. It's this massive event at Lake Tahoe with 2,500 cyclists, and she did it to raise funds.
Going from preparing for the end of life to cycling around Lake Tahoe is just astounding. And achieving a medication-free remission in a disease that is traditionally considered incurable but manageable, that is a profound shift.
They keep that positive momentum going with Article 8. Author Dana Green published a collection of short stories set in Maine.
I saw that.
Yeah, his story, This World Will Remember Me, actually won a silver medal from the 2026 Next Generation Short Story Award. The anthology comes out in July.
It just forces us to remember that patients are authors, cyclists, siblings first. The disease is just a passenger.
Exactly. Susie and Dana are the ultimate return on investment for those grants we talked about earlier. The goal of treatment is to get you back to writing books and riding bikes.
Beautifully said.
But we do have to acknowledge that not every day is a bike ride at Lake Tahoe. Sometimes the journey gets incredibly tough, which is exactly why the newsletter pivots next to practical support for the hardest moments.
Because navigating the psychological toll is just as critical as the physical one.
Right. So Article 9 brings up a Lymphoma Research Foundation webinar featuring Dr. Elizabeth Brem from UC Irvine. She specifically focuses on relapsed or refractory disease. Basically, what to do when treatments stop working.
That is easily the most terrifying moment for any patient. Knowing how to communicate with your healthcare team then, and understanding how to pivot to clinical trials, is an essential survival skill.
And right alongside that, in Article 10, they feature a recording from Triage Cancer with Julie Larson. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she focuses heavily on managing the specific weight of uncertainty.
Building resilience against that uncertainty is so hard.
Right, because the shadow is always there.
Always.
But we see a real-world example of that resilience in Article 11. It's a logistical triumph, honestly. The launch of the Heartland Support Group for Nebraska and Iowa.
That was a great story.
It was led by Janie and held in a church in Valley, Nebraska. The text notes, some people drove 3 hours, others used Zoom, and a grandchild even made a custom welcome banner.
That 3-hour drive really speaks volumes.
I really want you, the listener, to imagine the sheer dedication required to drive 3 hours, just to talk to someone who understands what you are going through.
It underscores that while virtual support is great, face-to-face human connection provides a totally different kind of relief.
And the foundation is providing that in very specific ways. Article 12 is a rapid-fire calendar of upcoming niche support groups.
Highly specialized groups.
Yeah. There's a TP53 group led by Jane on June 14th, an LGBTQ plus group with Jean and Jane on June 18th, an in-person Ireland meeting hosted by Bob Perry on June 20th, and military veterans led by Ray and Bethany Mills on June 30th.
Let's unpack that TP53 group for a second, because that is a very specific subpopulation.
What does TP53 mean?
Well, TP53 is often called the guardian of the genome. It is a tumor suppressor gene. In a healthy cell, if the DNA gets damaged, TP53 steps in and says, stop dividing, we need to repair this. Or it tells the damaged cell to self-destruct.
But if that gene is mutated,
then the stop sign is completely gone. The damaged cancer cells just keep dividing recklessly. Patients with a TP53 mutation often have disease that is much harder to treat and resistant to standard therapies. So a patient with that mutation has a very different emotional and clinical journey than someone without it. Creating a dedicated room just for them ensures they don't have to explain their unique fears. They are simply understood.
But, emotional support is great, but logistics and money are often the biggest hurdles, which leads us to the final pages of the newsletter, section 5.
Right, the safety net. Because financial toxicity is a debilitating side effect of cancer treatment.
Article 13 outlines a partnership with NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. They run a travel and lodging assistance program. The newsletter highlights that 12 people in 2026 have already received funds for second opinions or clinical trial screenings.
Think about those 12 people.
If you need this, the phone number they gave is 203-308-5858. 5902.
Without that funding, they might have had to settle for standard, local care simply because they couldn't afford a plane ticket or a hotel room near a major research hospital.
Article 14 runs through other open U.S. patient funds. There's HealthWell for WM, Cancer Care for NHL, and Blood Cancer United for clinical trials. The money is out there.
Centralizing these resources in one update is a literal lifeline for patients.
Finally, we round out the newsletter with holistic wellness. Article 15 introduces a request for community feedback via an anonymous integrative wellness program survey.
They want to know what actually works for people.
Exactly. And then Article 16 is the June wellness calendar. They recommend dropping into a class and reaching out to Anne McMullen, the director of integrative wellness.
You know, this raises an important question. When we look at this whole ecosystem, the yoga classes, the sound baths, the travel funds, we have to ask if treating the whole patient might actually be just as critical to long-term survival as the BTK inhibitors we talked about earlier.
That is a great point.
Medicine keeps the body breathing, but wellness and community give the patient a reason to take the next breath.
That perfectly captures it. So let's recap the sheer ground we've covered today.
It was a lot.
It really was. We went from new staff with Kim Schwartz and video editors like Rick Savoy to Italian kidney research showing standard treatments still work. We covered new CLL data proving the safety of inhibitors, Susie's amazing bike ride, Dana's short stories, and a massive safety net of emotional and financial support.
We traversed the entire landscape.
So what does this all mean? For you, the listener, it means that a medical diagnosis isn't just a list of clinical facts. It is an entire ecosystem of people working to lift each other up.
Before we go, I want to leave everyone with a final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
If we recall the very first item we discussed, that European Forum's theme of chronos, or time, and we combine that with Susie's miraculous CAR-T recovery where she became completely med-free.
Right.
As science pushes us closer to functional cures, how might our fundamental definition of time as a patient shift in the next decade? Will the agonizing watch and wait timeline eventually become a relic of the past?
That is an incredible thought to end on. The future is moving fast. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep connecting, and we will see you next time.